Recording. Good to go.
All right. Hi, my name is Buck Curtis, and welcome to the Sacramento Sword School's Destreza dialogue series. So the goal of a conversation like this is to engage the community over a wide range of topics. This is not a Maestro Knows Best discussion. What we're going to do is try to avoid showing our cards and actually generate a conversation with all of you guys and gals, all you peoples. And hopefully that will allow us to sort of test some of our ideas, maybe get some feedback on some of the things we're thinking about. Audience members are encouraged to participate, but you're welcome to lurk, unless you're Caden, and then I may just force you to say something, which is what I did to him last time. Okay, so last time we took inspiration from Kate Hickey's idea of opening with a series of questions and asking you to rate from 1 to 5. And I think we want to do that again. So we have prepared some questions where you in the chat will rate from 1 to 5, and 1 being I disagree with the statement, and 5 being I strongly agree with the statement. All right, everybody clear on that? Please enter a number 1 to 5 in the chat. Oh, everybody agrees.
Saying is different from agreeing.
Except for Tim Rivera, who is giving us a poor man's version of pie.
I think the stirring is starting.
That's what I think. Oh, I win, Mr. Rivera. That's as many digits as my HP calculator could store on the screen. So that's what I remembered from engineering school. All right, let's. I know we just want to check because we're lonely and we're all in lockdown, but let's get to our questions. Okay. Rate these statements from 1 to 5. Using a movement of decrease to reduce strength in the bind as a form of invitation is bad fencing because Pacheco says invitations are vulgar. I'm seeing some disagreement here, some 2s. I have 3 2s. A lot of follow-on 2s, and Ken says 4. I'm sorry, Ken, I outed you. See a 3? People hedging their bets. They're not quite ready to commit, right?
Yeah, I think that's what it is, yeah.
Yeah, mostly disagreeing with that statement.
Yeah.
So I'm counting out the numbers so that because the chat isn't visible on the video later. Okay, let's try this one. Do you want to do the next one?
Sure, I'll do it. Learning fencing is typically the process of conforming your performance and body to the system. Learning Destreza is different because it is the process of conforming the system to your body.
Seeing a lot of 2s and 3s.
Yeah.
Really stumping them today. I think this one we should pull out for more conversation later.
Yeah.
Okay, this is a pair of statements. So let's listen to both of these, and then I'll repeat them, and you can rate both. Okay. The generals are attacks. Or the generals are actions on the blade followed by attacks. So ready, the first one? The generals are attacks. Rate that from 1 to 5. Wow, this is pretty decisive. Lots of, mostly 1s and 2s. Okay. The generals are, go ahead.
I said that's mostly from people who have taken classes from us.
Oh no, we've introduced a bias. It's hard to introduce people who are consistently correct when they answer questions into a chat like this.
Generate conversation when we're in a bubble.
Yeah, okay. The generals are actions on the blade followed by attacks. Oh, mostly 4s and 5s with a 1 from Caden and a 1 from Tim. All right. Why don't you pick up the next one?
Well, okay, so in Destreza, an attack may be used into the adversary's weapon to create defense. So repeating, in Destreza, an attack may be used into the adversary's weapon to create defense.
That one's getting mostly 5s and 4s. There's a 3 in there. A lot better support for that than I would have guessed. All right. Here's the nightly let's judge a fencing master question. Gerard Thibault's method is tangential to Destreza, but is not true Destreza.
How do you want to
Getting some disagreement. Some people say they don't know enough to say, so they're disobeying the rules and just not typing a number. Okay.
Radha's Atahos 5 through 8 are more correctly generals. You should not have called them Atahos.
Oh my gosh, Rod is taking a beating. The 4s and 5s all the way down the board, except from Tim, who is over there giggling on his monitor.
I don't have any of the actual Spaniards here, though. They probably would
I know,
the
they
other,
can't
right?
defend him. Poor Rada. It's hard to be so wrong and so dead that you can't defend yourself.
That's right.
Sure, he
After
was
hundreds of
killed.
years of other people getting it right.
Yeah, I know. I think Pacheco actually killed him in a duel. That's what I heard. Okay, this is a pair of statements. This is our last 1 to 5. Listen to both options together and then rate them both. The difference between true Destreza and vulgar fencing is the list of codified techniques in the system. I'm going to just repeat that one. The difference between true Destreza and vulgar fencing is the list of codified techniques in the system. Or, the difference between true Destreza and vulgar fencing is correctly using the context to determine the best technique for that moment, regardless of the codified techniques in the system. Now, I'm going to read both statements again. Oh, it looks like everybody's already jumping in. Let me read the first one. The difference between true Destreza and vulgar fencing is the list of codified techniques in the system. How many people agree with that? Pretty low. I see some 1s and 2s.
Not much agreement.
Yeah. I personally made this a devil's choice so that you might not be happy with either answer. Okay. The difference between true Destreza and vulgar fencing is correctly using the context to determine the best technique for that moment, regardless of the codified techniques in the system. Lots of 5s there. All right, and of some 4s, pretty much everybody. And Ash is our most hedging of the bets there. He's not ready to toss out the techniques in the tradition, I guess, like everyone else is. Like, just forget the techniques. Okay, we had one that was interesting. So let's open up for conversation now on this particular question. Ready? Learning fencing is typically the process of conforming your performance and body to the system. Learning Destreza is different because it is the process of conforming the system to you and your body. Let's talk about it. Who wants to go first?
For me, it's a middle. It's not a question. Like the two statements you have given are extremes, right? And the truth is actually in the middle. That is where you conform parts of yourself as you can to the system that you also conform, while central principle of remaining defended at all times. Don't do anything that would threaten your defense.
Lois wants Medeo.
What's a
A
medio?
medio.
It's a question because, like, kind of like in English, it's got a lot of meanings. So medio can mean middle, half, measure. So when I'm talking about, not going to extremes, I'm talking about the Aristotelian concept of not going to either extreme, to the dead quiet extreme, to the overactive extreme. You want to stay in that golden mean where you're in the virtuous middle, as they say. If I have sections of the first dialogue mixed up, we're going to hit that in the next release. We're going to hit the talk of the mean, and we're going to hit the talk of a walkthrough of the four causes in the next translation.
My disagreement on the statement was
As,
but I think
conforming for myself.
so. Yeah, I was against it. The statement just because, to my mind, for any good system, you're conforming the system to yourself as well. Once you've actually learned it, you're using the subset of that system that actually works for you in your body. When I do Italian rapier, I'm not doing certain actions because I'm short and they don't work for me. Whereas I'll still teach them to other people who have a different body.
I'm minded to disagree with the idea that in Destreza we are conforming the system to ourselves. I think that the idea is the system is supposed to describe the kinds of movements and forms the body can make being a physical object in space. It gives us a description. And Tim and I had a conversation about this a while ago about how prescriptive versus descriptive Destreza is as a philosophy. And because it was largely applied to a certain type of weapon in a certain type of context, I think that there is a lot of seeming prescriptivism that comes out of it because you're told, okay, well, this is how you make an atajo, and this is, but as we know, everybody disagrees. What I think Carranza was trying to do was say, this is a way of thinking about bodies in space. What does understanding your goals, your causes, and the material causes of the fight, what does that tell you about what the fight should look like? And then how few movements, how few techniques can we master that will nonetheless give us the ability to control the totality of the fight in terms of spatial relation, in terms of the relevant geometry, right? So I don't think that we're conforming the system to ourselves. I think that the system helps us to describe what is going on, and then we need to make the conclusions necessary to adjust what may or may not be, capital U universal truths to what we are capable of physically, adjust for causes. But I don't think that Destreza is as prescriptive as Tim does. But I don't see it. I don't see.
So let me ask you a question on that note. I apply Destreza all the time to things that have nothing to do with sword fighting. So from that perspective, couldn't you say that I am conforming the system to myself or my circumstances?
But when you're adapting it, are you simply saying, okay, well, for example, okay, I'll do longsword Destreza, right, as an example. And so what I did was I grabbed a little bit of the two-hander advice that we get from Godino and Figueredo in terms of montante versus montante, and say, all right, I'm going to largely keep a roughly middle guard. I interpret that as a langort that comes back into a plow on either side of the body, nails up or nails down, depending on which side I'm on. When I'm doing that, am I saying, okay, I'm going to start in Langort because it's the closest thing I've got to an angulo recto? Or am I doing that because I think that there's something to the angulo recto in terms of being able to control space, right? By occupying the middle of my lines, it has the shortest path to travel to be able to defend and cover any part of my body that may be threatened. Is that why we're doing it, or are we doing it because we're diestros and we have to stick our arm out, right? I think how we approach the material and why we think and how we test the hypotheses that come out of the system and are suggested by the system, it depends on sort of how we end up coming up with an interpretation that can be applied to different materials. So if the science is suggesting something because we want to be able to make the fewest, shortest, and thus fastest movements in order to attain what we want and remain safe, are we coming to the same conclusions as the foundational treatises? Or are we looking at the conclusions of the foundational treatises and saying, well, fuck it, let's just do this because this is what they were doing, and so I'm just going to adapt it without giving more thought to the structure and the why this might be happening. And that's going to be a finer line to walk depending on the weapon, because depending on how similar or different the mechanics of the weapon are, the more we can fall into sort of the lazy, okay, well, I can do a general with a spear because I can make it I can make it form a cone that will control the space in front of me. But is that necessarily the safest thing to do with a spear? Okay, well, now I've got to go test this and see whether or not it creates any dispositions with a spear that don't exist when I'm using a sword alone. Right?
So it kind of sounds to some degree like we're talking about invention. And, is it possible to invent new Destreza? I mean, I think if you look at what we know about the system from the resources that we have, there was certainly some kind of evolution and some change. Part of that was driven by, changes in weapon technology over the years. But that's kind of the interesting question, isn't it? Is it possible to create something new that still follows the, what we would call the principles of Destreza, that's not established in any of the canonical works that we have?
Mind if I add my 2 cents?
Yeah.
Okay. So the way I approach this question is my little joking story about how Destreza was formed was, the stuff that we were doing in the Middle Ages and the early Renaissance, that's all well and good, but we're modern people, we know now. So let's rebuild fencing using geometry and physics. And I think the understanding that Destreza is based off of geometry and physics, I think that's a key idea. And so Basically, the techniques are ways in which you create an ideal geometric situation and where physics, and you create a situation where physics works to your advantage. And sometimes, and so there is an ideal. There is an ideal situation that you do have to conform to. However, how you get to that ideal situation, you will be limited by your body and your weapon and what you can do, and by the other person. So I think that in that sense, in the sense of you need to get to this ideal situation that's good for you and advantageous to you, that's you conforming to the system, that's you conforming to the principles of geometry and physics. But how you get to that ideal situation, that's where you're going to have to be a bit creative. And then I'll just toss out that Viedma, when he's describing, teaching somebody Destreza, especially somebody who's, experienced an old system, he's like, yeah, it's going to feel really unnatural at first, and it's going to feel awkward, and that's okay. He explicitly says it's going to feel weird. Just stick with it. Just let it become second. It'll become second nature through practice. So this issue was addressed historically by at least one person. At least one person said it's going to feel awkward. Let it be second. It'll become second nature with practice.
Tim, are you chewing on a response there?
Actually, I was just waiting for things to get quiet here so that people could actually hear me. So going back to the point that Ash made about descriptive versus prescriptive, to me, Destreza is both and can't decide which one it wants to be. So fundamentally, it's trying to be descriptive, but the aim is to be prescriptive. So it ends up by not separating the two. A lot of authors kind of fall into that trap of saying, well, this is how it's supposed to work, and here's the justification for why you should do it this way, and why they end up arguing with each other. So they're trying to prescribe, this is how you fence, this is how you do things. But they're just using the descriptive portion in order to back up their reasoning in kind of a pseudo-logical way, and then they'll just resort to name calling, evoking dead Greeks in order to make their stuff seem more legitimate. So that's kind of the point I was trying to get at. So I mean, there's a descriptive side to it, which is the part where you can analyze what's going on in order to make your determinations. But there's also the portion where the authors are saying, well, I've done the analysis, here's what you're supposed to do. This is the way that you do it. And it manifests in things like the Atajo having to be over the top. It has to be on top, it has to be with natural downward force, because that's what Aristotle, thought was great. And so, here's the example that you throw a rock in the air and some other rock's coming down and they meet each other. Well, when they meet, they're going to go down. So therefore, down is always better, and then you should always be going down. And so that's the part where it kind of, I think, trips over itself and doesn't really get to where it could be. But to kind of speak to the larger point that goes to one of the later questions, I think there's a difference between, for me, what Destreza was and what Destreza is. So what Destreza was is set, locked. That's what was written down. It's the way that they practice it. We're not going to know everything, of course, but, we have the text that can kind of tell us what it was. But for what Destreza is, we have to include what it is now and what practitioners are doing with it, the way that they're reviving it and carrying on. So I think that's an important distinction to make when we talk about what Destreza is. We have to say, do we mean in a modern context as well, or are we talking about just what it was back when they were publishing?
So, to what degree do you think there was an older influence of teaching, right, where if you look at a lot of old apprenticeship programs, there's not necessarily a lot of theory presented all over. It's like you do something over and over until you're good at it, and over time you acquire an understanding just through practice. And then we've got Carranza trying to bring philosophy into fencing to a bunch of people who are just doing practice more than thinking. Do you think that's an influence in what's going on? Like their early authors are trying to break out of that? Crickets.
I didn't know if that was to Tim. I've got a thought that just occurred to me in that conversation. Just given the timing of when the texts were written, up to that point, with most people being taught in person by an instructor, and with Fiore, with Morasso, where the books were in many ways written for people who were still studying with them, I'm curious if the specificity of Destreza in part came from the new aspect of having to try to write something for readers who you would never see in person, and how much were they still feeling around the edges of, I'm trying to teach a physical art when you're not going to have an instructor with you. And I really feel that with Thibaut, where he is so excessively explicit in places because I know you're not going to be there. Are aspects of like the numbering system of the swords trying to be more precise for a non-present student, and that being a new thing given where printing is at that point. I don't know if that's tangential or not, but it was just a thought that came up out of this.
Well, I think it's important. I mean, the point that you made, Ernesto, because I'm trying to think, and there's very few Destreza authors that actually talk about who taught them. You know, Figueiredo does. He mentions Gonzalo Barbosa, who's his instructor. Viedma talks about his instructor. And then I'm drawing blanks after that. You know, Carranza specifically says he had no maestro. As far as we know, Pacheco didn't study with Carranza. He just picked it up. So I think there was that tradition of authors picking up the work just from reading other people's books, as opposed to it being transmitted in person, or at least that's what they want to admit to.
Yeah, and I was partially thinking back to when you and Puck did that piece at Racine that time, where the sense I kind of got was, here Viedma shows you this, Godinho shows you this action, and then Pacheco comes in and gives a little more specificity of, okay, here's when to use that, and here's, to let you know when it's safe, as opposed to trying this cool new trick you learned that gets you killed because you don't know the timing and tempo of it. It may have stuck out more to me that way because I was trying to force movements to conclusion back then when I really shouldn't, and I was getting beaten on a regular basis for trying to force things I shouldn't. That's a general trend.
Fortunately, I've never had that experience of forcing a movement, a conclusion in the wrong spot.
But yeah, it's interesting to see what people took away from that, because when Puck and I were talking about it beforehand and kind of putting a class together, we intentionally made it to where the things that we showed were very disparate at the beginning, but they gradually came together to kind of illustrate how close together things were within these two traditions. Because, I mean, there's only so much that they had to work with. They didn't completely start from a blank slate. They started from the fencing that they had, and even if they haven't been taught it, they'd seen it and they know what it looks like, what it's supposed to look like. So it's very hard to culturally get away from what a thing is supposed to look like when it is known that this is what fencing is, or this is what swordplay is supposed to look like. You're gonna even unconsciously be biased towards that when you're trying to create something new.
I think that relationship between and true schools is also what makes Viedma so interesting.
We lost him.
Solving problems.
So I want to go back to a point that Eric brought up about doing things like over and over and over again until you get it. Like for me, like that's an important part of how I learn by doing just the technique over and over again until I can internalize it. So this isn't just in Destreza, but for like me learning like another skill, like even when I did like math problems earlier, you know, just more practice, and then eventually I get like this aha moment, and then I can start applying it to different things and even like extend. I don't know how to describe it, but like kind of like expand on the technique, so to speak. So like rote repeat is pretty important. And then sometimes so you just repeat it over and over again. And then that kind of ties into like the, like how the authors wrote their books, especially with Viedma, where he tells you to keep doing the drill. And then he'll say something like, practice will uncover more or something. So yeah, for part of the learning process, you're meant to repeat something over and over again until you develop some like insight into what you're doing, right?
Yeah, and you know, as teachers, like we sometimes run into a student who will, you know, ask questions and try to understand something in their mind before they're willing to even try something. And really often, if they would just try it 20 times, they would get it. You know, I don't want to say that's universal, but like really often, like you have to do something a certain number of times in order to understand it, no matter how well you think you understand it without trying it. There was a study, I think it was in a college about whether people focus on a single thing or a quality of a single thing or quantity. Ceramics class, and half the class was going to be graded on making one perfect pot, and the other graded on producing 50 pots of any quality. And who made the best pot? The ones who made the 50 pots. Cool. Buck's putting a link in the chat here. The pots analysis comes from the book Art and Fear by David Bales.
So, can you guys hear me? My Wi-Fi is spotty.
Yeah.
Yep.
Like half the class is told to make the perfect pot. The other half of the class is told, make me as many pots as possible. And at the end of the year, we will grade you by the weight of the pots that you created. And the group that made a large number of pots at the end of the year, they were making much better quality pots than the people that had strived for perfectionism. So I call it the 50 pots problem, but sometimes somebody will come to me and say, I have this problem, and we have to decide, is this a technique issue or a pedagogy issue, or is it a problem that we can solve by making 50 pots? And we'll send people to do reps until they get it.
So there was actually another thought that occurred to me a little while back in the conversation, and it has to do with what Tim was saying about kind of what it was then and what it is now. And the thought that occurred to me was just kind of, my mind was momentarily blown by the realization that like the education level then was very different than what it is now, you know, at least in terms of all the people that are encountering Destreza as a system. You know, it's pretty safe to say that all of us have been exposed to physics, you know, in school, at least to some degree. And so a lot of the things that maybe weren't even considerations for a lot of the students that those manuals were written for are things that we kind of take for granted, and they're also woven in with other sort of understandings of that level that we don't really, think about consciously at this point because they're so ingrained in our education. And it's interesting just to think about like that, both that as a challenge and how that must have colored what the writers of the treatises wrote, with that in mind, knowing that there wasn't that level of understanding necessarily. But also just the way that has certainly colored the way that information was received and practiced in Destreza then versus the way it's received and practiced in Destreza now.
So we have a comment in the chat from Ash. He says the causes have changed. The knowledge in the KPDA loop has changed. KPDA loop, I believe, is knowledge, perception, decision, and action.
Yeah. And that's something that I like. I like that the conversation sort of heading in this direction, and touched on this, is that this is a living art again. There are schools which now have multiple generations of instructors and masters. That means this is a living art once again. People's interpretations of the foundational texts, people's new books, people's new research is changing the way people practice the art. So we are now in a point where we are taking part in the rekindling of a science that got interrupted early on. And that's I think some of what we run into with what Tim was saying, that we have these treatises that were written from the perspective of individuals in a certain context, like you're saying, John, that had a very specific education level, a very specific understanding of natural philosophy, not even physics yet, that had a very specific understanding of things like Aristotelian scholasticism instead of the scientific method. But so did all other sciences at that time, right? The things that have now become physics and chemistry from alchemy, and right, all of these observational sciences that we have developed that began during the Renaissance as these outgrowths of an attempt to rekindle that classical scholasticism. Those other sciences got to keep growing and changing and being altered by new discovery and having new texts add to the corpus and overturn old assumptions that were based on perhaps imperfect knowledge. They've benefited from that, whereas we haven't really. And we see a little bit of it, obviously, when we see people applying LVD to saber, to spear, to bayonet on musket. Like they are doing what Carranza sort of intended, right? It's a universal philosophy of arms. It is intended to be a science that we can apply broadly. But then it dies, and we stop being able to apply our present scientific understanding until now we have revived it, and we are now moving into this place where we can have these discussions saying, okay, what are we keeping? What's baby and what's bathwater, right? What are we hanging on to that is actually a universal philosophy that is applicable to our contexts in a modern sense, and what is strictly historical fencing? And I know that I was ruffling some feathers last time when I was, because some folks were saying like, okay, but if we're teaching historical fencing, then we got to stick only to the historical sources. And I'm like, yeah, but we're not teaching historical fencing. We're teaching a martial art that evolves and can evolve, has it written explicitly into the system that it ought to evolve. And that's when I say that I think it's mandatory that we try to experiment with Destreza as an application in other ways. You don't get a decent science if you're not testing the shit out of it, right? That's how we science, is we test the thing, we come up with hypotheses, and we attack these ideas aggressively, looking for holes and dispositions in them. And that's how we improve our art.
So there was another question that we were going to dig into, but I think this is a good place to bring it up because we're already talking about it some. And it was this: if we begin to alter the techniques, do we lose the soul and culture of the tradition?
Well, I feel like a lot of the like Destreza techniques is designed to keep you safe, so you can like do other like actions that are different than classical Destreza, but they still somehow keep you safe and should be fine, right? Because if that's your primary goal and you remain safe and well defended, that shouldn't be an issue.
Yeah, sort of along what Caden's saying. There are certain core concepts, which is don't attack unless you're defended, don't attack unless you're protected, and while you can do a lot of variations on a theme from that, you'll start to find that, like an electron cloud, certain techniques are going to maintain a recognizable shape. So as much as you might go off and depart and start finding, start exploring the extreme that a technique might look like, that still adheres to I am accomplishing my goal while still being defended, you'll eventually find that once you take a look at all the stuff that you've done, it's going to start collecting into techniques that we already understand. You're going to find that applying spirals in a particular way is going to be the best way to protect yourself as you maintain a particular distance from an opponent. Like, oh, look, that looks like the generals. So I think if you stick to some of the main mileposts of the science, you can go off and experiment while still trying to keep within those parameters. And the more that you do that, you sort of get a stipple pattern that matches a lot of the techniques that are already written. You might have a different way of applying them because of your personal circumstances. Like, if you're a Diestro who keeps fighting Italians, well, you're going to end up looking a bit like Tejero, maybe, which is fine, because Tejero was adjusting Destreza techniques and concepts to deal with Italians who liked to attack low and often had a dagger in their other hand.
So, Lois, are you sort of saying that if we try to alter the techniques but still stay true to the philosophy of Destreza, that we're not actually going to successfully alter them very much? We're just going to alter them within a reasonable amount to fit the situation?
I mean, there's always going to be some outlier thing that you might discover that works for you or that works for people in general that was discovered by the authors because they're also working within their cultural and philosophical parameters. But I think for the most part, you'll say, I've fundamentals down. I understand the fundamental principles. I'm going to go out and play, and I'm going to see what I can find. You may find one, two, or three things that will follow those principles of keeping you protected while you go about your business that don't look like traditional Destreza. But for the most part, I do think you'll eventually find things that will roughly fit that shape. Like, I worry I'm not making myself clear, but I don't make myself clear. Like, I'll give you this example. I was having a very hard time applying generals in a fight because the way that we practice them, it break them down and we keep them very, it's a very artificial environment in which we teach them because they are complicated, especially to people who haven't picked up a sword before. It can be really to understand the whys and hows of a general can be really hard. And it was only after doing practice with a couple of other fencers that I started to learn to identify them in the wild. They don't look very much like the textbook of a general that we tend to use, but they are generals. And I only understood that after doing a thing and then my partner going, so across, and I'm like, did I? And then I stopped and thought about the process that had just occurred, and I'm like, sure enough, I did. And so we might be able to expand the parameters of what fits a definition or expand the parameters of the definition to adjust things. But I think generally speaking, they're all going to remain in a rough, stippled shape that shows a lot of what we already see in the books.
So
I could be wrong. I may not have been able to experiment enough yet. So
I just want to like follow up with a clarifying question, because can you guys hear me okay? Okay. I said that learning Destreza is the process of conforming the system to you and your body. And that's sort of an intentionally like, confrontational or extreme version of it. What about conforming Destreza to the context in which you find yourself? Is that a more acceptable version of the statement based on what you're saying?
yeah, but as the conversation has gone on, I'm at a higher statement, which is, practicing forming the body. I think actually there's a lot of truth in that. On its face, you're right. It's confronting. My brain immediately went, no, but with a bit of, I actually think there's something there. So, I mean, there's always going to be adjustments. We always have to adjust for causes. That's like one of the core things in this Destreza, which is lovely because it means you don't have to pin it down. You just have to be accountable to yourself about the decisions that you're making in relation to whether or not you want to be doing this Destreza and which, out of the broad library of content that we have, which of the Destreza you are choosing to use.
I think kind of dovetailing into that is it's interesting because we have this sort of like 14 actions of Destreza, right? And that gives us this set of building blocks, both from a technique standpoint, like actual things to practice, but also a framework for translating pretty much anything. Like I've watched, a lot of fencing of all different styles and stuff ever since I started Destreza. And I'm pretty much translating things into Destreza terms in terms of like what I'm seeing. And so that's sort of the interesting kind of side question here is we have Destreza as a series of 14 actions that we can use to describe any kind of engagement. Are we lacking any actions? Does there need to be another one? Do we need a 15th or a 16th in order to like really complete the system? Or has it over the years and centuries, has it been whittled down to really the essential building blocks, which you can then use to literally describe, well, yeah, he's an Italian fencer, but he's doing a general here or whatever. So it's kind of an interesting question.
So part of the question here was, do we lose the soul and culture of the tradition, right? So maybe rephrasing that a little bit is, at what point does change lead to losing the soul and culture of the tradition? Or maybe to what degree is change part of it?
So I have a bit of an idea about that. I've been so it feels kind of appropriate because 16th and 17th century Spain, how Catholic are you? Yes. But for whatever reason, I'm remembering stuff that I'd heard about Cardinal John Henry Newman's work on the development of doctrine. And he actually has some really, really good guidelines about how to unpack an idea while still maintaining the integrity of it. And I forgot the exact criteria. I haven't read the book myself, but I need to because it's got so many good ideas from what I've heard so far. But Newman says that one of the things is that you do have to preserve that essence. So the outside form can change, but this essence, what makes the thing itself, it does have to stay the same. If you start doing something, if you change that, you've changed the thing, and it's no longer the same thing. So applying it to Destreza, you know, what is the essence of the various techniques? For example, right angle is, my understanding of right angle is you're maximizing both defensive distance and offensive potential. And it's a medio from which you can make the smallest movement to do what you need to do. That's the essence. If you start doing something different, if you start having a completely different goal, and if you change those core criteria, you're not doing right angle anymore. But in order to meet those criteria, you might not be sticking your arm straight out at the opponent's face. That was one thing, and I'm really going to have to go back and listen to those lectures to figure out what he says. But look up John Henry Newman and his criteria for development of doctrine. That's all I wanted to throw out. Just look up that guy. Look up that guy. Look up what he says. He's got good ideas. That's all I can do.
So what's the doctrine of the faith of Destreza? What's the what is the soul of the art, right? I think that as soon as he says it's a philosophy and it's a science, it demands to be tested. That's the only way. It has to be challenged. The form has to change. And I think that as Lois says, right, a just for causes is sort of one of the prime directives that we have. And the only way that we can test whether or not something is universal is by testing hypothesis with it and following from that. I think that's the soul of the art, is understanding. Seeking understanding is the soul. And we do ourselves a disservice if we treat it solely as historical in that context. Like a lot of HEMA clubs that, you know, are like, no, okay, so we do mayor and that's it. And, you know, we only stick to the text and only to interpretations of this one text. And we don't really cross-reference, or we don't really add anything modern, or that guy wanted to suggest something from his EIDO class, but fuck that war. Like it seems a bad way to approach it. Although I do agree, and tangentially, I do agree with Lois as well that, yeah, if we are applying these principles, and if these principles do what they say they do, which is to provide us with that condition wherein we can control algorithmically the spatial relations of the fight and thus the time of the fight. If they do what they say they're going to do, then we're going to keep finding those same principles throughout. That's the hypothesis, right? We're going to keep finding those same techniques. We're going to keep finding those same principles repeated because they have a geometric function which aids in that algorithmic imposition of order on the chaos of the fight. And that's, as I said, like jujitsu and battlefield jujitsu, like old Japanese jujitsu and Fiore. You want a jujitsu guy helping you learn and teach Fiore if you've never taught a grappling style like that. And the reason is people still bend that way. 500 years and 1,000 miles apart, they still bend that way. We are an armature of geometric forms and shapes that have to move through space and abide by laws. So if we have a good set of laws and principles that can be tested and with which we can falsify word's gone. That we can apply to the examination of the world around us in this context in combat, then we will keep finding those same things. But in order to see that those are universal, we have to keep looking and testing those hypotheses along the line to see if we keep finding the same things. And if we don't find the same things, then it's not actually a scientific approach. It's just another trick. It's just another vulgar technique that happens to look like it works, and then we discard it. But if it's true, and we can prove it to be true, and we can prove it to be true across a bunch of different contexts, then it's true, capital T true.
Let me challenge you on that a little bit, Ash. Can you hear me? So we had a student in our class who was under 5 feet tall, and she was fighting with like monsters, bears, right, who are over 6 feet tall, using weapons with 40 inches of reach. Well, she's packing like a 30-inch, 35-inch weapon. What she found was that right angle wasn't going to work because she can't outreach anyone. And getting her blade on top of the adversary's blade is really difficult and almost useless to her in many cases. So I think we've disproven both right angle and a Tahoe. So all that's left is moving to conclusion. Checkmate.
Okay. Was the student engaging the right angle at the appropriately chosen MDP, which is based on the gigantic, monster's weapon and reach? Yeah, like the idea of have steel between you and the opponent in such a manner that they cannot strike you, I think, and this is where we start arguing about what is an atajo, right? Is it the function of having the blade over because that provides more security, right? Or is it simply being able to place a blade between you and the vector that the opposing blade has to occupy in order to reach you? Like I argue that everything that works about German fencing works because of atajo, right? These guys just pick a medio proporcionado and then jump into it is all they're doing. But when they strike, they're supposed to be closing their line. What happens? Their blade comes across the body. The leg on the side that is exposed is being refused, right? They are crossing the opponent's blade, usually to, like, as they strike. They're occupying it actually from above in most cases. They want to deliver the aggressive overhand cuts and then end them rightly, right? What they're doing is they're just really rapidly adopting an atajo with verve. But that's what works. When they screw up and they don't close their line, they don't form an atajo, they die. Just like everybody else, right? If you don't have a atajo, you're going to die. So when I see somebody like that, somebody that's short, facing monsters, okay, that right angle isn't going to last long. You want it there because you want to make sure that you have the center of all four of your coordinates, all of your coordinate directions that you could possibly occupy, because no matter which vector their blade occupies, you have a short distance to be able to cover that line. That is one of the functions of the right angle to me, is placing the guarniciones and placing the defense at the center of all of the possible vectors so that you can cut off whichever vector ends up being used because it has to describe a longer path to get to you. Or if we have cups and we're doing this traditionally, they've got to make a dispositive movement in order to be able to get to you, even if it's just to get around your cup, right? So you've now got time on them. And you see guys like De La Vega in particular, who, shit, do I have it?
So Ash, I don't think what you said is true. At least in my experience, I'm a shorter fencer, and I've had people like Devin Borman with a 42-inch weapon bend their arm and basically use an inarcata, where the arm is bent and the sword is tilted back towards the adversary. They can entirely work around my right angle. I'll never strike him because his reach is so much better than mine. My only answer, I can't counterattack in that position. I have to parry repost. And that would be even more true for our much shorter fencer. I think, like, let's make this a more general question to everybody. We've got this fencer who is shorter than average, right? And we've got these two powerful defenses, our two primary defenses, which seem to be coming up short. How do we walk this person along? And is Destreza big enough to create new fencing for this person? Or has it failed this person? Or is this person failing the tradition because they're not able to execute? Does that question make sense? Like this topic? Let's unpack that a little bit.
My first thought is combining. Where my brain is going to combines this with Italian, because we have a guy like that locally who is really tall, has long arms, and instinctively rolls up into an Italian imbricata on me. Where my response is going to be a spiral to cover the blade. So effectively going into a general that takes me into an Atajo onto the weak side of the blade and going from there, but I can't do it as a single action. His excessive reach and the angle he's at makes me have to take it into a compound action in order to get to the point that I can do that. So I think the actions still fall within the tradition, but it's not going straight into here I'm going and getting the Atajo. I have to do a spiraling action to take that off of what his attack is going to, his action is. Does that make sense?
So I put a quote from, it's the most recent release, the translations I'm doing in Compendio. And this line has really, really been sticking in my head, which is, quien pudo podrá lo menos. And it's an argument about not living in right angle. You do not want to live in right angle. So the tense are just so clean and poetic and distilled, and I'm having a hell of a time trying to draw that out into English. But the general idea here is who was able to do the most, which means you're in that central position that Ash is describing. Supposedly, you're in the center, so you can quickly do whatever you need anywhere because you've occupied that central position. You'll actually be able to do the least. You'll have the least ability, the least energy, the least momentum and pressure to apply. And in that paragraph, it's Charilao saying you need to be in your body and your body or your sword needs to be in some extreme for you to be able to execute any technique. For you to be able to execute a treta, you cannot start out from right angle. You can't. So from that perspective, maybe living in right angle is an extreme. It's one that doesn't serve you.
So I found that occupying a right angle in the center is it doesn't work too well for me. But if I employ Pacheco's slight invitation, right, by closing off my outside high line, so almost like, so I'm in, I just close off my outside high line. And then from there, I have a more potent Tahoe inside line, right, because I have more distance to travel, I guess, more force can be applied, crossing to my inside line. So, and it also, it's also an invite, right? So I can employ that, a Tahoe inside, and then hopefully deliver the half reverse to the mouse. So I changed how I'm applying the right angle slightly, but still staying within, I don't know, the general guidelines, so to speak.
Lois, can you pull that out into English a little bit? Oh, there it is.
I threw it in Spanish. I'll read it quickly. So in Spanish, it's bien consideréis que hará la treta con más facilidad cuando no estuviera el cuerpo en medio, ni la espada, y el brazo en la mejor y más larga postura, estando en el ángulo flaco, y el cuerpo en alguno de los extremos que pudo tener, porque quien pudo podrá menos. So I've translated at least this time around as, you would do well to consider that the body will perform a technique more easily when the body is not, nor when the sword and the arm are in the longest posture. Better to be in a weak angle, with the body in one of the extremes it can have, because the one who could do the most will be able to do the least. I mean, there is so much to unpack there. Like, I worked on that about a week and a half ago, and my brain has not let it go. I would write a blog post, but I'm still wrestling with it. Like right now, I am not to be like, I've read this, I'm feeling this out. Here are the 3 ideas that I'm sort of, here's the X number of ideas that I'm sort of working out. I'm not there yet. I am still wrestling with it. Because I'll think of something and then I'll counter that thought. And I'm like, no, I'm not ready to develop that out.
Maybe.
I don't know where this is going exactly, but it sounds super important. That last line about who can do the most will be able to do the least. I mean, that's pretty huge, and it seems to speak a lot to the idea of really things being contextual and not being dogmatic about applying the fundamental concepts as the sort of default way of operating, and really being moving, being flexible, and not being like right angle is the only correct guard. That sounds pretty huge.
Honestly, like that when I read, when I hit quien pudo lo más podrá lo menos, it hit me like a Shakespearean couplet at the end of a line of dialogue. Like, when in Midsummer Puck is ending one of his statements, he'll have that couplet, and it hit me just like one of those Shakespearean couplets. And I'm like, I know this is important. I know this. So if you all want to help me figure it out, that'd be awesome.
And it occurs to me, if you're at right angle, you're especially with the heavier weapons of Franz and Pacheco's time versus the lighter weapons of De La Vega, you're not going to be able to do much of a cut because you've got to do the full preparatory action to do it. You've got with a heavier sword, if I'm here and I just lift and do a small cut, yay, that's a point for us in our tournaments, but it's not going to actually do something in a real fight. If I'm at right angle, I've got thrusting actions, but anything that's going to involve a cut is going to be, 2 to 3 movimientos to get that around, to build up the momentum to have the sword actually do any damage.
So I know that I wasn't going to jump in and offer opinions, but since you're asking for interpretive feedback, I think both of the 2 examples that he gives in the text there are about loading. So when we see Carranza talk about the middle of the body, he's talking about keeping the weight evenly positioned on either foot. And that's going to allow you to transition from one to the other. And I think this is where he's talking about. And in order to act, you're going to need to load a foot. So the person who has the most potential also is able to do the least because they'll have to perform a loading action. Same thing with right angle. If you need to throw a cut or you're going to form an Tahoe to cover up, there's a loading action, a dispositive action that's going to happen before you can get there. So right angle might give you the best reach, but you can't cover a cut from it. I think it's about loading and the requirement to load.
Fencing is paradoxes. Neither person can strike unless they are within medida de proportion. Once within that distance, who gets to strike will be depending on who has entered an extreme and created an inequality. So we have to have some kind of an extreme to work with.
So Caden has asked that I bring up Hick's law. It's not Steve Hicks, the famous researcher of historical fencing arts, but
So that's a different law.
yeah, Steve Hick is a guy who did a study on choice. Can you guys hear me okay? Like, let me know if I cut out. And what he determined was the number of choices available to a person under experiment caused their reaction time to increase on the exponent. So on an exponential curve. So if I have one choice, I can react really quickly. If I have 2 choices and I have to pick in the moment between them, I take a lot longer to decide. And the way that applies to fencing typically is if we take, for example, in a Tahoe, that restricts the adversary's choices to liberating a new line, and suddenly we make ourselves artificially faster by reducing the number of options available in adversary response. I really like that because I think it's an example of applying science to Destreza in a way that Carranza might enjoy, but he didn't have access to that study. I'll post a link to that in the chat.
I think there's a schematic component both to an algorithmic component rather there to the uptake of information as created by the system, and the response to that perception as well, right? We have a limited number of movements which are intended to control space decisively, intended again, right? And we have a certain number of conditions which will trigger those reactions. And I think that's one of the vital components of the style, is being able to say, okay, we know somebody. If I've cut somebody off of 3/4 of my potential field, right? Like the only open line, because of the way that I've placed my sword across theirs, is for them to either disengage and come back up my center, or something striking in on my high inside, because they will then have to wheel around and come at me. I know where they're going. There are only so many options, and so I can make the decision of intercepting them just a little bit later than I would if I had absolutely no clue what was coming. And I can make it more decisively, and I can combine a movement of my body to get myself off the line while I take control of their line. And I think that's... Yeah, I think that reducing the number of choices that we have that will yield the highest probability of controlling the geometry of the fight is one of the that is one of the things we're seeking using this style, or ought to be looking at anyway, and seeing whether or not what we are offered actually serves that function in the real world.
Shall we pick up a new question?
Sure. Yeah. For one you specifically want to move on to?
Just go crazy. You can pick. I feel like you have the power.
So in a similar vein to what we've been talking about, how do you mix different parts of the tradition together harmoniously? Do you not do this and just work from a single author? I think most of us probably do not work from a single author. How is that different than altering techniques, right? We're, in this case, talking about maybe bringing in a technique that someone else altered, right? Like Rada, for example.
Well,
how
it seems like
do you blend the whole tradition together, or parts of it together?
Well, it seems like authors just, they describe like something very similar, but they just name it something else, like Rada's inferior Tahoes. And then like when I think it was Jose was giving his lecture where we asked him, like, if you have an Tahoe on the inside line and then they disengage and then you follow in a circle and then place a Tahoe again, what would you call that? He said, I think he said he just calls it another Tahoe on the inside line. Whereas Vietnam would call that a rounded Tahoe, or maybe some people consider that like a weak over strong into an Tahoe. So that motion is the same. You're just calling it something different. right? So I guess like different authors may not be that different after all.
So what about cases where you just ignore what someone says? And I'm not talking about Pacheco, because we probably all ignore a lot of what Pacheco says. But if there's something that just doesn't work for you, you just say, "Oh, that doesn't work for me or my student or whatever it is," or is there something that fundamentally you think is not coherent?
I don't know. I don't think I have enough of an understanding of the differences between the various authors. But if I see something that feels incongruent, especially if it's from early versus late, I'll often try to look at it for the context of why one side had it and one side didn't. For me, the biggest one are some of the later actions, like the lower Tahoe's responding to that dropped Southern Italian stance and the thrust coming from so low. And basically, then when I'm telling people about them, I try to put it in the context of this being a response to something else that showed up in the 1660s, 1670s. So you don't see it on the earlier texts because they weren't facing that. So I'll try to find the context for why it was left out of one place and in another one. Especially since in a modern setting, we're going to see people who are using that whole range of things, not just the items that any one of the authors would have come across. So that'll help anybody else diagnose how to apply theory to what this random person you see in the tournament's doing.
So Ernesto, based on that idea that you're developing, do you think that maybe that's Rada's motivation in promoting generals into like 4 more core Tahoes? That he's reacting to something?
Yep. And I've noticed like people fighting with, say, the Darkwood rapier foils. It's really hard for me to maintain that high line of Tahoe on them because they just slip away. So being able to come and take that and then just drop it down when they do that disengage has been a really useful response that once I look at it that way is still playing in with the same theory or within the theory.
I'm still fairly early stage, I think, in my fencing journey. But I tend to but I've noticed that history tends to repeat itself. Other people have said like the human body only moves in a few ways. I personally use the phrase the opening lines from Disney's old Peter Pan cartoon, which yes, there are some problematic subplots, but I still like the movie. It has the best sword fighting in any Disney movie, but the opening lines are, "This has all happened before, and it will all happen again, but this time it happened in London." And I constantly keep, that's one of my favorite little like quotes of all time because I feel like it's so true in so many areas of life. But when it comes to fencing, I've started to read more of the treatises, and I've started to look at more of the sources. I've kind of realized, like, you know what, the things that people are like talking about, like, oh, how do I do this, or like for example, like how do we deal with there was a discussion that lasted for months about like how to defeat the people like the gunslinger fencer, with the low point and whatever. And I just realized, like, it's just the Marcelli school with a slightly altered guard. It's all happened before. It will all happen again, but this time it happened in the SCA. And so then I can go like, so then what I do is like, okay, this problem's already been encountered before. What did somebody say? And, you know, historically, people were saying, like, don't be super aggressive, hold your sword in a cute angle, really make sure that you define an advantageous center line for yourself, stay off the original center line. You know, there's other advice, but I'm just like, you know, we have 100 plus years, 100, 200 years of people encountering all these fencing problems, and you know, somebody's probably encountered something similar to your problem before, so let's not invent the wheel twice.
So I'm going to take kind of a different approach because I don't like mixing authors at all. I like keeping them separate, which the more I talk to people, the more I find that that's not common, except for the Rara guys. I mean, they really, like, they're in love with Rara, and Rara's everything, so they don't need to look anywhere else. But it kind of goes back to something that Ash said earlier, where about recreating historical art or, you know, evolving the art that was meant to evolve. So for me, I don't have any interest in taking the art and recreating it and extending it. For me, it's just it's more of a curiosity. I just want to try and recreate what it was as closely as I can because I'm just curious about what it was. I don't have any interest in you know, any universality of the art or trying to search through different authors to find answers for anything. Like, to me, I don't care. If a particular author doesn't have an answer for something, he doesn't have an answer for it, or it wasn't written down, or whatever. So I'm more interested in saying, like, well, this is, you know, early Pacheco style, this is Viedma style, this is the way Tibble did it, this is the way that Figueiredo does it, this is the way that later Pacheco does it, this is how Edenhard does it, this is how Rada does it, and I like to keep all of those things separate. And to me, as soon as you start blending any of those, it's a new thing. Whether or not it's Destreza, like, who cares? I don't care to argue about that because that's just where you draw the line between what is and what isn't. So for me, anything outside of, you know, once you start blending two different authors, then it's like that's a whole new thing, and that's just you know, I mean, that's something new that you're creating.
So how does Tim do it?
I don't. I just like, I will consciously, whenever I'm fencing, I will consciously try to use a particular style. So and sometimes, like, when I fence with people, they'll ask, you know, hey, show me some of whatever. And I'll go, oh, okay, yeah, let me, you know, get my mindset right. I think, okay, Godinho, okay, attack. All right, nails up, nails down, close it off. Okay, go. And then I'll, you know, fight Godinho style. And personally, because there's a lot of things that I find in Destreza that I don't agree with at all. But I will do them, and I will try and get them to work because that's a part of the style. And so, like with Godinho, there's a lot of things in there that are kind of dangerous and risky, but I'll do them anyway because that's what's a part of his style. And I try not to deviate from that as much as I can. I try and stay within the parameters of a particular author, I guess. So, you know, if I'm just kind of left to my own devices, I'll just deviate, but I try and stick to one particular thing. Like, I'll just do the way that Viedma says it, or I'll try and make it more like what's in Grandezas, or I'll try and, like, now I'm trying to figure out how Figueiredo did things and trying to just stick with his style to kind of get a handle on that thing.
But I have a question for you. So, like, when you, like, for example, are focusing on doing Viedma, do you ever find yourself in a situation where you're like, where you maybe naturally, like, break out into, like, I don't know, like a Figueiredo thing?
Yeah, and then I get upset at myself for doing so. I mean, there are definitely points where things blend with each other and overlap. And so there's really good ways to combine these things and take them together. And whether they were done that way historically or not is hard to say, because, you know, we only have what's written down, and they didn't write everything down. There's no way. And so whether something is historical or ahistorical that way, I mean, it's fine. Even Viedma, like, he talks about, you know, your practice will uncover these things. Or he'll say, I don't need to cover more on this because Pacheco already talked about it in Grandesos, so just go and look there, and he's got stuff there. So having overlap like that, or things that blend nicely into other things, is fairly natural. I try not to do it. I try and get into a particular mindset for an author, you know, get their flavor of how they fight. So then I feel like I'm less inclined to find things that they didn't write down that they would have not approved of, if that makes sense.
I'm sitting here thinking about some of the other research going on in some of the other styles, like Bolognese, where you've got the 5 different authors over there, and they fill in the gaps on each other in the aspect of being aware of what each one is saying. I think helps allow you to, when something is unclear, have a better sense of filling that gap with something from the tradition, as opposed to instinctively filling it in with our modern frog DNA. Like, even on that side with Vigiani, who people used to look down on. But as I remember Greg pointing out, that he teaches the best biomechanics of the system, so you're going to be better at the other 4 books if you've studied that one. So I can see where, and Godinho may be separate since he was Camun, but looking at Viedma or Pacheco, especially the ones that are closer, temporally close to each other, can help fill in the gaps or the unclear parts of one author with the background knowledge of what his contemporaries were saying. But also, I see the same thing on the Italian Rapier side of having, you know, I think Giganti's got holes, Capaferro's got holes, Alfieri's got holes, but when you have them all together, they help clarify each other.
Yeah, I think that's true as far as it goes. But I think you got to be careful with that, because there are some things that are explicitly not done in certain authors' opinions, or things that shouldn't be done in a certain way. And if you're not careful, you can gloss right over that and end up stitching things together that aren't meant to be stuck together, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so I think for something like the Bolognese, it's a lot easier, because stylistically, it's a very stylized kind of thing, you know. Whereas Destreza is not supposed to be that way. You know, it's not supposed to be adhering specifically to a style or a way of movement. It's supposed to be a little bit more scientific and finding the correct answer. And because, like we mentioned earlier, you know, a lot of them are just they didn't necessarily learn from a teacher. They didn't get the physical instruction. They just maybe got it from a book. So they're not necessarily bound in the same way. And so things like Viedma, for instance, and the way that he likes to do his generals, not just the fact that he's got 7 of them, but the, you know, hand positions and things that he likes to do are very, very different. And so if you you can kind of pull some things in, and they might fit or they might not fit. And I think if you don't have a good handle on that particular author, then you may end up introducing, you know, not necessarily frog DNA, but like lizard DNA, you know, something that's close but not the same thing, and kind of polluting your understanding of that particular author. So it's a balance trying to find both of those, but you know, they definitely need to be done, because like Viedma is explicit in saying that he doesn't have all of it. You got to go look at Pacheco. And people who don't read Spanish that have tried to read the Viedma translation into English know that not everything is defined in there. So you've got to search elsewhere to see what he's talking about.
So we are at the top of the hour at this point. I think we could probably wrap up discussion. The goal tonight was to have fewer topics with deeper discussion. Is that working for everybody? All right, and we still find that this is, nobody should apologize for speaking in this. That's why the dialogue exists, right?
So we have a number of other questions that we didn't get to because we had a good dialogue going on. But if you have questions that you think would be interesting to discuss, send them to us and we can add them for a future event, a future dialogue.
I'm back. I dropped and I have network problems.
That your time traveling?
Yeah. I could tell when things go south because everybody's picture goes blank and I get spinning circles across the board. I may need to just get a new laptop at some point. So we'll host more dialogues as we try to get more speakers. When it comes to speakers, if you have ideas for speakers, we have been reaching out to our friends and just talking to people that we think have something to offer. But if you know somebody, I know that Daniel recently recommended somebody to me, so I'm going to reach out to that person. But if you know somebody, let us know and we'll see if we can get them to agree to a lecture. Looks like we want a whole dialogue on acometimiento, and Denise wanted us to force every person in the dialogue to say acometimiento. So be prepared for that. Okay, so next week, I teased last time that we have somebody who's going to talk a little bit about Destreza in the New World. And Jorge Luis Pacheco has agreed to give us a lecture. He's in Mexico City. He's done a lot of good research into Destreza in Latin America and I think South America as well. He's answered questions on this topic in some of the online groups, so look forward to that. All right, that's all we got, folks. Stay safe, and yeah, it'll be awkward making fun of Pacheco when we're actually having somebody named Pacheco deliver the lecture. Everybody be on your best behavior.
Yeah. All right, so we just surreptitiously drink when we're thinking bad shit about Pacheco? Is that just... And, yeah. everyone else will know, like, oh, yeah.
All right.
About the other Pacheco.
Yeah. The other Pacheco.
Call him old Pacheco.
You can refer to him as Don Luis Pacheco.
Pacheco, señor.
We could refer to George as Colonial Pacheco.
Colonial Pacheco.
Or you could call one the elder and one the younger.
Yeah. Perfect. Pacheco señor y Pacheco joven.
Got the quick and the dead.
I suddenly want to make him a coffin so he can just get a little pole and spin around in it, so he can just have that meme to send when people say bad stuff about Destreza. Here, there's a picture of Pacheco spinning in his grave.
For some reason, when you said that you wanted Pacheco to spin around on a pole, I was thinking of something else.
Oh my.
Now, mine was not, I don't know where you guys are going. Mine was about like putting dollar bills in his waistband.
Oh man.
As long as you can describe it using canonical Destreza terminology.
That's right.
It's a circular motion, so Aristotle
spirals, yeah.
He's doing a general.
Ends the dance in nothing but the rough.
Yeah. We have clearly jumped into this conversation, and we should stop. This is the point where I will have an editor to trim this off.
Or leave it as like an Easter egg in the credits, right?
Right.
Right.
Yeah, make the next video like an extra 3 minutes long, and then just tack this at the very end of some dead air.
I think for the Blu-ray release, we should somehow include all of the comments in the chat section for each of the lectures.
Oh yeah.
All right, I am gonna bail on you guys because tonight is Lord of the Rings night with the twins.
Ooh,
I will.
yes.
We are we're just a few pages away from the chapter called "The Siege of Minas Tirith." So
Ooh, nice.
that might be good.
Yeah, yeah.
Might. We'll have to wait and see.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, I will talk to you guys later. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks all.